Hey guys, so Furina is rerunning in a few days and we took a bunch of questions on a community post and there's quite a lot of questions to get through. So before I get started, I do want to say that my opinions are from the experience of not just being a theory crafter and a speedrunner on my own account, but since I've started streaming, I've done tons and tons of viewer abysses and account reviews. Those of you who have watched the streams, you'd know that maybe a third of the accounts we look at haven't got 36 star before, and people are unsure if their accounts are good enough or maybe they have skill issue. But after a few tweaks, we still basically get 36 star always. So it's safe to say I've played a lot of accounts and I know how Furina impacts a variety of players and not just my own. So the two teams I like the most at the moment and make abyss clears basically free this patch are the Neuvillette Furina Kazuha Core and Kokomi Mono Hydro, and I play both of these on the bottom half. You guys know how lethal the bottom half is. You take a lot of damage and you need to break a lot of pyro shields, and both these two teams are basically perfect for it. I've actually had a few streams where I pretty much first try 36 star using one of these teams bottom half, and like I said, probably a third of viewer abysses we've done this patch, I've used one of those two teams to get the 36 star for them, whichever one they've had on their account, whether they have Neuvillette or if they have Yela and Kokomi. I would say the strongest thing about this Kokomi team is that a lot of people have suboptimal builds. I know many of these abysses, people haven't had Prototype Amber, people don't have Ocean Huge Clam. They probably also haven't pulled on Weapon Banner much, so they don't have much of erroneous weapons for high energy requirement teams. And then with Neuvillette teams, people often don't have a shielder, so I end up using just a random character in the 4th slot. So overall, these mono teams having no energy issues and having high raw damage makes them instant win buttons for the current abyss. And if you're looking for Furina teams this patch, these are the two I would definitely recommend for the bottom half. So this question here, content creators often glaze Furina a lot as the best unit in the game. How true is this, especially for newer players? Quite a few people wanting to know my opinion on her strength, and I do want to get this out of the way first since I know it's a hot topic. And yes, Furina is very strong and very popular, but no, I don't really think she's the strongest character in the game. So firstly, let's speak on the positive sides and what makes her so strong, and I can tie in these other questions like, is she one of the strongest 5 stars for pull value? Is she a must pull unit? So the first point is on someone's account, whether it's mine or a viewer's. In an abyss, you obviously have to choose from 8 characters, and I would say from my viewer abyss experience, the chances that Furina would be chosen for one of these 8 characters was almost guaranteed every time, whatever DPSs they play on their account, or even if they play some sort of quick swap team like Hyperbloom. Furina basically always picked somewhere, and honestly, you could just say it's that simple. Furina is very versatile and she's proven to fit on a bunch of team archetypes as a buffer for hypercarry teams or multi-DPS teams, and even just as a Hydro applier, which as we showed has been very useful this abyss and basically every abyss this past year. But that brings me on to the negative side, which is why I think she's not the strongest character in my opinion. The first one is for this whole year, so I've got some Spiral Abyss history, and basically aside from one abyss, which was the 4.3 abyss where you had the Hydro Tulpa in chamber 3 of the first half, basically Hydro teams have never been countered, never been punished for the entirety of Fontaine. Meanwhile, there's been shields and specters that can break pyro teams, Dendro characters, electro characters. I know Wanderer and Xiaomains have been annoyed with all the bosses that are resistant to Anemo, also resistant to Cryo. You can go through all these abysses for yourself, and just basically every team archetype has had its time in the sun and moments out. People always joke that Neuvillette gets countered by a Hydro Slime, but that's the thing, they haven't actually been doing that. And there's also been things like many AoE chambers where enemies are in a straight line, like this, perfectly set up for Neuvillette to blast them with his hydro beam. But I do want to focus this more on Furina than Neuvillette. The point is that whilst they're both strong characters, no doubt for sure, the game has wanted you to play hydro characters and teams for a while, and that's kind of why they've been so consistent. Second thing is, I know people might want to point to Furina's super high usage rates, but actually I think things like this are a bit of a trap, and there's two main reasons for me. Is the first one, yes, Furina is high, but look at the top 4 characters. It's literally Neuvillette's team, and Furina has 94% usage in 4.7. Neuvillette is just slightly behind. And if you look at the overall ownership with this survey, Furina is at 84% and Neuvillette at 74%. So actually, when you look at both of their teams, you can see a significant amount of Furina's usage is actually with Neuvillette. And honestly, a trend that keen observers have noticed, many characters actually live and die by whether Neuvillette either uses them or has overlap with their teammates. Like, does your character use Kazuha and Furina? Well, so does Neuvillette. So because he's so popular, many players aren't actually able to use that team for their other side. On the other hand, maybe there are characters with popular teams that have very little overlap with Neuvillette teams, like maybe a Hyperbloom team here or a Bennett Xiangling team. Then these characters are free to have a lot of usage, although even with Child's situation, I'm sure he is impacted by the fact that he really needs Kazuha. Funnily enough, Baiju pretty much getting wheelchaired in usage because of him fitting in Neuvillette teams is just a peak of this. You can see how most of the recent abysses, you can make Neuvillette teams with all the highly used characters. This is 4.5 as well. Neuvillette, Baiju, it's always been him on top lately. Now, you might argue if Neuvillette didn't exist, then Furina will still have like 90% usage, but that will be spread out into other teams. And whilst that could be the case to a degree, I do think she is being helped by Neuvillette to some amount. Like, all these characters who Neuvillette uses are basically being pulled up at least a little bit. So overall, whilst I would say she is good for sure, I do think it is very helpful to understand how distorted the abyss is these days, especially with broken characters like Neuvillette warping the game around him. So you might be asking, who do I think is the strongest character? And I made a video on it a while back, you can watch it if you're interested, but in short, I feel like Bennett is the strongest character because if you don't play him with certain DPSs like Arlecchino, Garming, Linny, Wanderer, I could keep going, but these DPSs will feel bad because the truth is most attack scaling DPSs are balanced with Bennett in mind. They are balanced on the assumption that you're playing them with Bennett, and to me Furina doesn't really do that. Neuvillette, Xiao, Alhaitham, Hu Tao, DPSs that like her, but they can still work perfectly fine without her, so this is how I judge strength personally. In fact, I could probably even argue Kazuha is still top 2 best character, since his grouping is still the most impactful grouping in the game by far. There are other characters with grouping, but it's a lot more scuffed. And he also keeps constantly getting new teams like Arlecchino and Cloren recently. In fact, I could even go further, and for actual new accounts trying to do the Abyss, I've found in my View Abyss streams that I actually get success with Neuvillette pretty much soloing one side by himself with any scuffed team. And there was even one situation where I used Neuvillette basically solo on one half and then Raiden Chevreuse. And then we took this new account who had never done Abyss before all the way to floor 11. Even though people don't really rate DPSs at the same level as broken supports. But I think the reality is Neuvillette is just such a broken brute force DPS that he just brings so much to the table, especially for newer accounts. And just a quick one, as far as comparing Furina with the other Hydro supports, this might seem like a strange answer, but I actually find I'm rarely comparing her with these two. It's only really like Hyperbloom or Hu Tao double Hydro or some double Hydro teams where I'm comparing Furina in her role to these guys. But what I found is that Furina teams are basically their own archetype, and what I more commonly compare her with is if she's a stronger choice than other strong archetypes that are not Hydro related. Like for example, for Navia it's Furina, versus Xiangling. For Xiao, it's Furina Shenyun versus double pyro. Lini, it's using Furina or playing mono pyro again. For Ayaka, you're comparing Furina Charlotte versus Shenhe Kokomi. And a lot of the time, those kinds of comparisons are a lot more tighter than you would think. But you could say that's one of the good things with Furina, is that if you invest in her, she can work well in tons of teams. But whether her archetype is the outright best in slot can lead into the next questions. Is Furina actually an upgrade for any team at C0? What are the characters which have Furina in their strongest team? She can be best in slot in many teams, but sometimes it can depend on your account investment, your playstyle. Like, are you a casual player who wants 36 star? Are you a new player who's just trying to clear the abyss? Or are you interested in speedrunning? So I can go through it. I wouldn't say Furina is best in slot at C0 for Clorend or Arlecchino. Arlecchino really wants constellations on Furina. She could be deemed best in slot for consistency on Garming, although I'm sure you guys have seen Melt Garming runs. Those have high ceilings, but honestly playing those are very inconsistent. Obviously Chevreuse teams don't use her, so that would be Raiden. Navia, this is a hot topic. I would say that a team like this with Chiori or Zhongli is still Navia's strongest teams at C0, but I know a lot of people do enjoy playing Navia Plunge. Now Neuvillette, I would say in general for most players in most situations, Furina is best in slot. But as you guys know by now, for some players who are speedrunning, you don't actually need to use Furina. For Lini, I personally wouldn't say Furina is absolutely best in slot for him at C0. I still prefer the mono teams for overall consistency and flexibility, and you can also get very good speedruns with them too. Furina teams on the other hand can be a bit more clunky, and definitely more clunky in AoE. They can get good clear times, but I usually see people playing them with constellations on Furina rather than actually at C0. Alhaitham, similarly to Neuvillette, I would say for most players and most situations, Furina will be the highest damaging option. But I know a lot of people do prefer Xingqiu's comfort, and some people also do prefer Yelan as well. I will say the one issue that I have noticed with Furina Alhaitham teams is because Shinobu is being brought to half HP by Furina, and then Shinobu cuts her own HP and she isn't on field long. That means when you're playing Alhaitham Furina teams, Shinobu is basically one shot away from dying the whole time. So although Furina can be Alhaitham's highest damage option, those are the issues that I've noticed, which explains why even in usage rates, Furina Alhaitham teams have never been his most popular teams. Sino gets an upgrade from Furina for sure. Then I know there's a bunch of characters like Wanderer, Yoimiya, Hu Tao, characters like this where Furina is an upgrade theoretically, and people do play them, but also casual players usually want more comfort using these characters with Zhongli, and then speedrunners might not be using Furina either. Kokomi, when you're playing it on field, you definitely want Furina. The Mono Hydro team is just a lot better than her other options. Xiao similar to Neuvillette, where for most players in most situations, Furina should be best in slot. But as you know, if you're speedrunning, there are situations where players end up using Bennett Xiangling instead. But overall, as you can see, there are so many factors that go into this. Like, I would say Furina is basically always best in slot for Klee, but then as I showed, there's characters like Xiao, Hu Tao, Lini, where it's situational. But I think the most relevant thing for most players is not whether she's outright best in slot in all these teams. It's probably the fact that she is at least in the conversation for so many characters and so many teams. It makes her a good investment ultimately, especially since most players aren't speedrunners anyway, so you're not trying to optimize the most finest margins. So just her being in this conversation, for most of you guys, that's a good thing. There are some questions about her constellations, like is the difference between C0 and C1 significant? Honestly, it actually is. This limit increase basically allows her to give 100% damage bonus at max, but the main thing is this immediate 150 fanfare when using her burst. So you're instantly getting 37.5 damage bonus to your whole team. And yeah, that is a big deal, especially because Furina's buffs usually are backloaded, which means this ramps up over time. So as you guys know, front loaded buffs are usually better. So being able to get some of this buffs front loaded is very noticeable. On top of that, there are teams that you can play her with where you might not be getting that much fanfare stacks normally. Like say for example, if you want to play Furina instead of Kokomi in this team. At C0 after the first chamber, you're probably getting no buffs and very little damage from Furina. Whereas with C1, you're at least guaranteed that very solid buff. Things like her C1 and C2 can be a big difference maker in a team like this. Interestingly, it doesn't only give damage bonus, but it also gives upfront healing bonus, which of course means you will be healing more, which means you'll be getting your stacks faster as well. So overall, it is very strong and it is noticeable. And then someone's also asking about the difference between C2 and C3. So just going to the wiki, you can see her talent level 13 versus 10 is 0.6% more damage per fanfare. So 400, which is the fanfare cap with C1. So that times that, meaning you're getting at most 24% damage bonus. So how does it translate into the team-wide damage? Well, I hate to say it, but as always, it depends on the team. The truth is, your team's damage bonus is going to be super saturated already, since you aren't actually getting 24% more total damage. With your base plus Furina maybe giving you 100% damage bonus and something like an elemental cup, maybe an artifact set, maybe Kazuha's buff. This is very overkill. Let me just remove Kazuha's buff. So 24 more damage bonus. It can be like a 10% increase. Maybe if you remove some stuff, it's still around 10. Move more stuff, it can basically be around 10% of an increase. So overall, yeah, I probably would agree with this comment. It's not really a strong constellation. I think most people are more likely to stop at C0, C1 or C2. Similar question, someone asking about my opinion putting for cons versus horizontally investing, putting different characters. I do get this question a lot, but yeah, it really depends on what kind of player you are. Regardless of if you're a free to play or a low spender or a whale, those things are honestly separate to whether you're a vertical investor or whether you're a horizontal investor. It kind of comes down to how much characters you are interested in and whether you just want to pull for your favorites or if you want to like treat the game like a Pokemon game and collect everyone. I know free to plays who vertically invest and free to plays who don't ever vertically invest, but I don't want to give too much of a cop-out answer. What I will say is, from my experience, you're more likely to struggle if you've never pulled on the weapon banner and if you spread your account super thin and you've never really invested and built your main characters. Some people might underestimate this, but there is a common advice that you should never put on the weapon banner. But actually, if you never put on the weapon banner, then how are you supposed to get things like your Favonius weapons, strong 4-star weapons with refines? The truth is that a lot of teams will actually struggle if you don't have your Favonius weapons, and I haven't even gotten into the increases you might get from 5-star weapons. And yeah, me personally, I don't pull for too many characters on my account. I would say for an account that started in 1.0 and someone who is a content creator, I would say that this is a low amount of 5 stars. But what that means is that I actually get to pull for their weapons and I actually have enough time to farm their signature artifacts. If you pulled Navia and then you pulled Arlecchino, you probably didn't get to farm her signature set. And yeah, all those things can add up. But just for argument's sake, there can be times where people have hard invested into Ayaka, for example. And then there's an Abyss which counters Cryo and Freeze teams. So yeah, that can happen. But in general, like I said, from my experience, it's way more likely for an account to struggle 36 starring if they've never done any vertical investment compared to someone who has done at least some vertical investment. Which teams benefit the most from C1, C2? I would say two main examples, which are teams that don't have healers and also teams where Furina is actually doing a lot of damage. So for example, people don't really play Arlecchino Furina at C0, but if your Furina is C2, then a lot of people trying to get the fastest clears will use that. As I mentioned earlier, there's also Ayaka teams. The usual downside with Furina and why Furina Ayaka teams aren't as good as Ayaka's old teams is because you usually need a teammate like Charlotte to heal. But if you can still have Shenhe's buffs, and Furina is actually doing something because you have her C1 and C2, then yeah, Furina should just be an upgrade of a Kokomi in this team. Lastly, teams like Furina National, maybe something like this, or using Klee where Furina is forward vaping and doing big numbers, then yeah, C2 increasing her buffs and her personal damage will be very noticeable. Plus it helps Furina's synergy with Bennett since his single target healing is less of a hindrance if you have her constellations. How do Furina Nilou teams work? Why do speedrunners prefer running Nilou Rena over other Nilou team variants? Actually, they don't really. The main reason why people used Furina Nilou teams, in the previous Abyss for example, Furina was actually able to destroy the Coppelius' shield, plus she also does help the team's single target damage a bit. But yeah, outside of that situation, I wouldn't say it's like Nilou's best in slot team or anything. Honestly, Nilou speedrunning isn't as popular as it was before, and the players who do speedrun with Nilou these days, they use a variety of teams. A lot of people still use the Kokomi Kole team that I played a lot. Comparison with C2 Nahida and C2 Furina. I wouldn't really compare them too much because there isn't actually that much crossover outside of like an Al Haytham team, for example. I'm not entirely sure of the damage comparisons for Al Haytham, but I believe C2 Nahida is stronger there. But the main thing with C2 Furina is that she is just more usable elsewhere. Obviously, Nahida is restricted to Dendro teams, whereas you can play Furina in Dendro teams, but you can also play her in many other teams. So I guess if I did have to compare them, I would pick C2 Furina for an account. And yeah, the key is actually very good for Furina. I think a lot of people know this by now, but in a lot of teams, Furina actually isn't doing that much of a team's damage, and she also probably has high energy requirements, so her signature is not that sought after. But in a lot of other teams where Furina is doing a lot of damage, like maybe this, a lot of those teams, if they involve reactions, then the key is actually similar to her signature weapon. It is a bit more clunky because you have to use her skill than her burst in order to get these stacks, rather than her signature being a bit more flexible. But the fact that you can use key on other characters like your Nilou or your Shinobu or Kirara. Plus, as I said before, a lot of teams are perfectly fine with Festering Desire, or maybe the Pipe if you have it. Like, I personally don't really care about getting her signature anytime soon. There's a question asking about her speedrun potential at C0. We were actually just talking about this in my Discord. I'm sure you guys know by now, but her long animations and her backloaded buffs, the fact that she isn't buffing that much in your Chamber 1, it does hinder her speedrun potential in a lot of those tight comparisons, like comparing her for Navia teams or for Hu Tao teams, sometimes even Neuvillette and Shao teams. But what we were talking about in our Discord is that there aren't actually too many popular speedrun teams. And by that I mean teams where loads of people are speedrunning with it. It's mostly Neuvillette teams, Child International, maybe Arlecchino, maybe Raiden Overload. I think most characters outside of those probably only have a handful of speedrunners and regular uploaders. So it is hard to get a true idea of the comparisons. Even now, even after multiple patches since her release. Like I said earlier in the beginning of the video, a lot of times you aren't even really comparing her with Xingqiu and Yelan. It's more about other team archetypes, like comparing her versus Xiangling or Kazuha or someone else. Especially for speedrunning, you really aren't comparing them. Like Arlecchino, you probably use Xingqiu or Yelan at C0, but if you have C2 Furina, then you'll use C2 Furina. A lot of other characters, you probably prefer Xiangling, as I said. If you're interested, I do recommend checking out the speedrun collection in my Discord. You can see there are quite a few players who upload runs with Furina, so you can check these out for comparison. There's a wide variety of teams. You can check previous patches as well, so you can use this as a guide. I myself have found some teams where she is very good even at C0 for speedruns, like Furina National, Klee, obviously Neuvillette teams. What sword is the best option? I would say for most situations you'd probably want to use the Pipe. Wolfang is better with like a Neuvillette team where she doesn't need much ER. But most other teams you probably do need ER. But I will say Fav is often overkill in most Furina teams, for my example. It's probably another teammate like Kazuha or Zhongli who could be using Favonius instead. Can you talk about Furina's Hydra application for vapes? The thing with this is that it actually depends a lot on the team. So obviously when you play a Plunge vape team like with Garming or D-Luke, it can be inconsistent, but Furina is still going to be the best option. Sometimes everything can go to plan, where you're vaping almost everything, but sometimes it can be a bit rough. She's also fine with Arlecchino, but you won't really play her with Arlecchino without C2 Furina anyway. Then there's Linny teams where there can be some inconsistencies, but if everything lines up well, then your Linny can do big damage. But aside from those characters, a lot of the time, you're either playing Furina in a double Hydro team, at which point a Hydro application doesn't really matter, or you're playing a Furina team where Furina is the one who's vaping. But if you want to see the setup, it is kind of very simple, but it also can be inconsistent. You can either use Furina's skill, then her burst, or you can use her burst, then her skill. The general rule of thumb for consistency in my experience is use Furina's burst, then her skill if you're not using Kazuha's burst. But if you are using Kazuha's burst, then you can use Furina's skill, then her burst. So I'll just show you, for example, here, Furina's skill, then her burst, then use Bennett's burst, and now I use Kazuha's burst. And you should swell Hydro there, and now you swell Pyro, and now I can go into the stat menu and I can see that my whole team got the Pyro buff and the Hydro buff. That will work in Furina National type teams, Furina Forward Vape type teams. Now I can show you without using Kazuha's burst. This can also help when you're playing like a Linny team where you want Linny to vape instead, so you don't want to apply Kazuha's burst. Furina burst, then her skill, then Bennett, and then this. And you can see there I buffed both. It can take a bit of practice to get the timing right, but you did also ask about Plunge vape team setups. Basically the way it works is you want to split up Shen Yun's burst and her skill. Like this is a perfect example of a setup. You see here Shen Yun's burst swirling Hydro, then Bennett burst, then his skill to apply Pyro onto the enemy, and Shen Yun swirls that with a normal attack to get VV off, and then skills after for energy, and then your Pyro character can deal their damage. Make sure to swirl it with Shen Yun's normal attack first because it comes out faster than her skill. And then yeah, that's basically how you set up with the Plunge teams, whether using Dilu, Garming. So this is an interesting topic, stance on YouTube content that utilizes C2 Furina and C2 supports in general. Most people like to undermine the achievements. Yeah, so this is an interesting topic. Obviously, I'm sure you guys know, sometimes you will see a very cool showcase, or at least it seems like a very cool run from the thumbnail and title. But then you click into the run, and then you see maybe it's a C0 Arlecchino or a C0 Chlorend or whoever. But once you watch the video, then you see that they actually had C2 supports. And yeah, I do understand both sides. The reality is, from my experience, a lot of people are just going to complain about anything. Like for myself, I don't really have constellations on supports, but people will still complain that my artifacts are really good, or maybe that I did a bunch of retries. Whenever I do Navia runs, I'm sure people complain that I crit every time I use her skill. In fact, I even remember a Sucrose National speedrun that I did a while ago, where I was getting complaints that I had an R5 sacrificial sword, and not everyone has that. So yeah, I think people would always complain about anything. So yeah, I think YouTube comments, Reddit comments, they'll always find something to complain about. So honestly, for people making videos, I don't think you should worry about it too much. It is what it is. But yeah, also I do see the other side of it, especially like you said with C2s like Furina C2, maybe Shen Yun C2, Nahida C2, Kazuha C2. I do see how viewers can feel clickbaited because these support constellations are so strong. There's also this meme in my Discord, seeing a C1 Hu Tao speedrun, and then it just has tons of constellations and weapons on her teammates. I think as long as you're not clickbaiting too hard, not trying to make it sound like it's a low cost team, then I think it's fine. This question wanting to know in a specific Neuvillette team, who should you invest in more? Neuvillette vertical investment or Furina vertical investment? The interesting thing with Neuvillette is that his vertical investment is very flexible. This was the single target DPS cup video which I did a while back, and like for example here there's people with C3 Neuvillette, C2 Furina, C6, C3, C3, C1 with C2 Kazuha. There's a lot of these runs and they're all basically getting very similar clear times. So I think from my experience, the thing with Neuvillette teams is you can basically do what you want. Although I will say it's slightly more optimal to be going more further with Neuvillette. You could probably even argue it's better to get a C3 Neuvillette before getting Furina constellations. There are a few people asking about Hydro versus HP goblets, and even asking about it at C2. The thing is, HP goblets are actually better at C0. And the thing is, even with this HP increase from C2, because HP goblets have a higher drop rate than Hydro goblets, on average, you're going to have stronger substats. So you can use the optimizer to figure out what's best for you, but it's almost always going to be HP goblet. Lastly, there are a few questions about pulling her, like use C0 Neuvillette on one side and Kazuha National on the other side. Would Furina improve your account? I would say pull Furina for your Neuvillette team. You might regret not saving for Natlan, but who knows, who can say. Is Furina worth pulling even when you don't like her character or playstyle? I would not say so generally, but because you play a Kokomi Taser team, you have to know that Kokomi Mono Hydro with Furina is going to be a lot stronger than her old Taser teams. Yeah, as this comment says, Furina is just going to be a huge upgrade for your Kokomi. But I will say, if you don't like her character and her playstyle, you can still optimize 2 teams that don't use her. Like, there are plenty of DPSs which don't use Furina even in their best teams. Even a lot of recent characters, like maybe you want to play Chlorend, who prefers Overload or Dendro teams. Arlecchino doesn't really use Furina without C2. You don't need Furina for Navia. You don't need Furina for Linny. So there is a lot of options that you can get into if you're interested. Is she worth your DPSs are riding Arlecchino? I wouldn't say Furina's worth it. This is a perfect example. You're riding, you'd rather play Chevreuse teams, and your Arlecchino without C2 on Furina, you'd rather play Xingqiu, Yelan, Xiangling. Arlecchino is very flexible. The last question is, do you think Hoya messed up releasing Furina this strong? And it kind of ties back to what I said in the beginning. I think she is strong, but I don't think she's the strongest character, and I don't think she messed up the game. As we said, there's plenty of DPSs, even plenty of recent DPSs who don't care about Furina much. Then there's also DPSs like Neuvillette. You can watch my analysis on him. But basically he has so much good things going for him, and you could argue he kind of invalidates a lot of the game with his perfect AoE, his self-healing, the fact that you're not punished for swapping out, the fact that you're not punished for playing Zhongli or Baizhu. There's so many good things going for Neuvillette that you can make an argument he comes closer to ruining the game than Furina. Then there's also classics like Bennett, who you can say he ruined an entire stat in the game. He literally ruined attack. He also ruined attack scaling DPSs, since most of them are balanced with Bennett in mind, and most of them feel significantly worse if you don't play him in their teams. Xiangling also ruining basically every single pyro DPS. They're always compared to her. Every single off-field sub DPS is compared to her. She has so many unintended mechanics, and the fact that she has basically 2 useless passive talents, and this Constellation's useless, this Constellation is almost useless. She has all these useless things, yet she's still insanely broken. The fact that she got nerfed from the beta. Guoba used to have a 6-second cooldown, Pyronada used to have a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost. So she had all those nerfs and she still warped the game. So yeah, the point is, there are plenty of broken characters, and like I said, Hoya have managed to make many characters and teams recently where you don't need to use Furina. So that's probably going to continue in the future, so yeah, I'm not really worried. So yeah, that's the end of the FAQ. Hopefully it didn't go on too long. Hopefully you found this video insightful or helpful. Maybe it helped you decide if you want to pull her or what you want to pull on. I know I didn't get to answer every single question, but if you do have any questions that you still want me to answer, then feel free to drop them in the comments and I'll try to get to them. Good luck for anyone who's planning on pulling Furina in her rerun, and yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed that.